Good evening and welcome. My name is Richard Reddy and I am the Director of Justice and Inclusion for Churches Together in Britain and Ireland, or CTBI. I'd like to thank you all out there in Zoom land for taking the time out to join us this evening for an opportunity to listen to some of the racial justice champions who feature in the newly published resource, Racial Justice Champions, Volume 1. Now, this publication is free to download from the Churches Together in Britain and Ireland website. And this particular webinar this evening is really based around that aforementioned publication. And that publication features 25 women and 25 men of all ethnicities who have pioneered racial justice in church as well as society over the last 25 years. And this publication was actually conceived to coincide with the 25th anniversary of Racial Justice Sunday, which was last year. But like a lot of stuff last year, it fell victim to the pandemic. As such, it came out this year to coincide with Black History Month. Now, this session is being recorded and it will also be available on the CTBI website. It's also being live streamed via the CTBI Facebook page. Now, the format this evening is pretty straightforward. Our speakers will talk for about 5 minutes each on the racial justice work in both church and society. And this is going to be then followed by an opportunity to ask them questions. So please feel free to compose your questions as they do their presentations. And I'll do my best as the chair to actually ask those questions. Just to say that keen folk have actually sent in their questions already, and I think it's appropriate to actually give them an opportunity to have their questions asked first. So without further ado, I would like to welcome our esteemed panelists, and what I'll do is I'll just give a brief introduction so that you get a better idea in terms of who they are, and then we will give them an opportunity to talk about themselves and their work. So the first person I'd like to introduce is very well known to most folk within the church as well as society, and that's the Reverend Dr. Indigene Ogle. He's a retired Methodist minister, and he was also the first non-white president of Methodist Conference in 2000. And among other things, he established the National City of Sanctuary program in Sheffield. Did that several decades ago, and at the moment, he is the lead for the Church of Sanctuary program in Britain and Ireland. We also have with us Glyn Gordon Carter, who for many years was the Church of England's lead person for racial justice, heading up the work for SIMIAC. And she's worked ecumenically in the field of racial justice locally, nationally, as well as internationally, and she served on the committees of the CMS as well as the USPG, and as well as being the Bishop's Governor at St. Saviour's and St. Olave's in London. She's also served as a local magistrate on the Milton Keynes bench, and she's the author of this excellent publication, An Amazing Journey. We also have with us Sandra Akroyd, who was the key person taking forward the URC's racial justice work for several decades, and she encouraged that particular denomination to engage in equality, diversity, and inclusion issues via reports, research, as well as resource material. And her activities saw her work closely with the Methodist Church as well as the Church's Commission for Racial Justice. And Sandra's also one of the contributors to the forthcoming book, The Race for Justice, and her chapter in that book is going to be looking at the URC's journey towards racial justice. We also have with us the Reverend Dr. Canon Rosemary Mallet, and she's currently the Archdeacon of Croydon within the Church of England. She's an academic and also formerly a university lecturer. She's a writer, a broadcaster, a researcher, and many other things too numerous to mention. But previously she was the vicar in Angeltown, Brixton, where she pioneered some outstanding work among young people to try and keep them from engaging in serious youth violence. We also have with us the Reverend David Haslam, who is also a retired Methodist minister, and he's been engaged in racial equality work for over 50 years. and he was formerly the secretary and an outstanding secretary at that for the organization, the Church's Commission for Racial Justice. He's the author of the excellent book, Race for the Millennium, and I've got a copy of that here, good book, which is still, I believe, one of the most outstanding books looking at racial justice in Britain today. We also have with us a man who, if you ever look at these webinars, needs no introduction to anyone, and that is the Reverend Wale Hudson Roberts. He's the Baptist Union of Great Britain's lead on equalities, and he's also one of the founding members of the Racial Justice Advocacy Forum. He's a writer, he's a public speaker, and he's an equalities advocate. And he's also another one of the contributors for the Race for Justice book, which his chapter is going to be looking at the Baptist Union's journey towards racial justice. We also have Reverend Ronald A. Nathan, who comes to us by the way of Barbados. And he is a writer, he's a public theologian, he's an international conference speaker, he's a campaigner, an activist, and also the past director of the African Caribbean Evangelical Alliance. He's also a pastor in the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. We also have with us this evening Dr. Mesiwa Raghis Gunder, who was born in Zimbabwe and is currently the program executive lead for overcoming racism, racial discrimination, and xenophobia for the World Council of Churches. He's based in Geneva, and he's joining us this evening from Geneva, courtesy of Zoom. He's a first-class academic and one of the finest scholars of Hebrew around, and his ancient Greek isn't too bad either. We also have with us, and finally, our last speaker is the Reverend Sivakuma Kalapan, who is currently a Baptist pastor in London. And for many years, he was the racial justice lead for the London Baptist Association. And again, his work was around racial justice, equality, and diversity. But, you know, Kuma was also one of the individuals who really kind of pioneered the contribution of the Windrush generation. I remember he came out with an amazing video that looked at the contribution of the Windrush generation many years ago. And that video still stands the test of time. He also organized a really good, groundbreaking conference looking at Martin Luther King and his legacy, and that was in Birmingham, I think in 2017. And again, he's another of the contributors to the Race for Justice publication that's going to come out in January. And his chapter will explore the South Asian Christian experience in the church. So we've got a stellar roster, a stellar lineup of some of the keenest minds in the church, some of the individuals who have played a pivotal, pioneering role in championing racial justice in British churches as well as society. So we're gonna have a fantastic evening this evening. So without further ado, I'm gonna ask our first speaker, Ron Nathan, to basically tell us about some of the work that he did in this country, as in Britain, in terms of racial justice. So Ron, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Richard. And it's a privilege to be among my esteemed colleagues, many who I've known for several years, and look forward very much to interaction with them. And thank you very much for our Zoom audience today. I think that I would limit my comments to my involvement in racial justice within the years that outside of Asia, because I'm aware that there is a question towards that. I have been involved in what I call cross-denominational and cross-sectional activities seeking to uphold the issue of racial justice within the United Kingdom in particular, and also internationally. My involvement included speaking to various Black community development groups because I was concerned that the Black church in particular was emitting an image that seemed, and I say seemed, to exclude the issues of Black representation and identification with the Black community. You see, the church itself can become absorbed in itself and in its own program and not necessarily seek to communicate to the wider community in a particular way. And so I took that on board and so made links with the Black Police Association, Black probation officers, Black social workers, the various Black MPs that we had, creating a dialogue and trying to find where were there commonalities in our approach to address the issues of racism within the United States, within the United Kingdom, and later on in the United States and further afield. The challenge that we have as far as racial justice is concerned is that there is an idea in our mind, whatever way we come to it, that we make progress or that we see substantial changes in overt or covert racism. What we don't always factor in is that every generation have got to be mindful and on the alert for addressing injustices wherever it arises. None of us are able to sit on our laurels and say we have achieved, because very soon we will find that circumstances change, and so do laws and the implementation of those laws. I was around when the Commission on Racial Equality in 1976 came into being, and the Race Relations Act. And many of us thought, wow, we've arrived. But we realized that a law in itself, though it protects us, it does not necessarily always progress the issue of racial justice in terms of how people interact, or even in terms of how we relate. And so with those opening words, I think I would stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ron. Appreciate that. Next, we've got Sivakuma. Over to you, Kumar, sir.
Good evening, Richard, and good evening, everyone. It's great to be with you this evening. So my primary involvement in racial justice comes out of my own spiritual journey of seeing my own caste privilege and prejudice, etc., from a Hindu background, rejecting that, becoming an atheist, and then coming to Christ at university. And I think I was rather rudely shocked to find racism within the church, which I didn't expect to encounter. My primary area of racial justice work was with the London Baptist Association from 2003 to 2018. And as Baptists, we pride ourselves on being people of the word. And one of the things that I encountered after my appointment was racial justice work takes away time, effort, and resources from the work of mission and evangelism. That this is a waste of time, this is a social gospel agenda, that we shouldn't touch it as evangelicals, was the kind of sentiment that I would hear. And my thinking was very much, well, that doesn't fly with my Hindu family and community, who say your church is riddled with caste and race prejudice. Who are you to say anything about Christ to us? You don't have a leg to stand on. And that, if you like, prompted me to say, well, what are the scriptural foundations? If we say we stand on scripture, what are the scriptural foundations to actually address these matters? So I developed courses on how and why we should talk about racial justice, why it's important to do so why you can't actually preach a gospel of reconciliation if you don't practice it, because as the Lord often, pointed out to the Pharisees, they were hypocrites, and that's what the world looks at us and says, you're a bunch of hypocrites. You preach this, but you don't practice it. And so it was really developing courses and so on to do that. One of the things that I was given an earlier responsibility was to care for probationary ministers. And in that arena, in terms of diversity of speakers, diversity of subjects, I made sure that, racial justice always figured, but also that there are different ways of offering ministry. It is not the Western model that many of them have been taught, that there are other paradigms that are equally valid, that are not, if you like, add-ons for those who are interested, but actually are as valid as anything that they've learned at college, and so that they can practice them. As Richard alluded to at the start, I realized that one of the things with the Windrush generation is much has been done about, written about them, spoken about them, but the issue of how faith sustained them in those dark times was not addressed. And so the DVD resource that I produced with another Baptist colleague helped to kind of address those issues of how faith sustained people in that journey. And it's something that I continue to engage with. In terms of the impact, which Richard asked us to talk about, it's difficult to quantify. I would say that those who were truthful, and I would always say this in training, please be truthful to me about where you stand, that they would make progress. But if they weren't truthful, then we didn't really have a platform to work from, and therefore they just carried their prejudices with them. And I suppose I'm out of that mainstream coal-face racial justice work, and what I've been horrified in the post-George Floyd murder is the strident manner in which even Christians, push back on racial justice matters. And I've just been, shocked by that. But at the same time, in one sense, not surprised, because there were many people who spoke the right things, but in their hearts, there was no real meaningful change. And in terms of impact, I would say one of the impacts, which I hope will have a continuing impact, is on the younger generation, because I remember some of the younger generation, when they were showing the Windrush generation, a Windrush video, said this did not happen. The idea that there were posters in windows which said, no Irish, no blacks, no dogs, that didn't happen, they said. And we said, no, it really did happen. And I hope that the reality of what they're seeing now, shocks them into seeing that actually this is real. And as Ron eloquently shared, this is something that every generation will have to go through. And in terms of the church's future, I would say the upsurge in interest, let us not be fooled by it. It will pass, because privilege and power will re-entrench itself. We have to be effective and act now. And I don't want to insult anyone by saying this, but I don't think any of the panelists are under 45. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. But we really need to empower the younger generation of prophetic voices on racial justice to speak and say, we're never going to be in a post-racial society. It's always going to be an issue. We always have to address it, and we have to empower the younger generation in order to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Kumar. And just to kind of just pick up on that last point you made, the publication Racial Justice Champions is called Volume 1 because it looks at the pioneers. Volume 2, which we will be working on very soon, will look at the next generation, the ones who I hope will finish the work that someone like you started. So that's a work in progress. Thank you very much for that, Kumar. Can we next have Sandra? Sandra, over to you.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Richard, for your introduction. I come to this webinar as I come to this webinar as a volunteer in racial justice work through the years. 30 years ago, the United Reformed Church decided to create a network of people called Racial Justice Advocates, and I became one of those people in my synod. The idea was to recruit a group of such people across the URC, which would provide a platform for advocates to develop understanding of race and racism in the church and in society. These advocates would work with their synods, their local churches and synod committees, and will play a part in implementing initiatives that were being developed at a URC-wide level. Around the same time as racial justice advocates were appearing in our synods, we appointed our first racial justice secretary. We have been served well through the years by Marjorie Lewis, Catalina Tafai-Williams, Michael Jagassar, and now Karen Campbell. The initiative for advocates and for a worker for the URC came from grassroots activities and not from a URC-wide committee. The vision was born from an annual event known as Calls for Celebration, where a resolution was prepared, taken to synod meetings, then on to the URC General Assembly. Another important platform for me personally was that of the Church's Commission for Racial Justice, CCRJ as it's known, a commission of CTBI. I represented the URC on this group for several years. For me, there were amazing and productive years, getting to know many people from other church denominations to share the work with them in the racial justice vision. One initiative was that of having a group each year to put together worship material for the Racial Justice Sundays. This experience with different denominations, ethnic backgrounds, theologies, and ways of being church was such an enriching experience, and many friendships were made. At that time, some of us teamed up and facilitated courses and one-off sessions on anti-racist and racial justice work with church groups of all kinds, and also theological colleges. For example, Queen's College, Birmingham, Salisbury College, and Westminster College, Cambridge. This was a very creative time for the development of racial justice work in ecumenical settings. And we were all well supported by the Reverend Arlington Trotman, who was at that time, when I was involved, the CCRJ worker at that time. We are grateful to Richard Reddy for his recent initiatives, which have been bringing the challenges for building an anti-racist church to the fore once again. This will help advocates and activists in all our churches to develop their work. Another challenging time for me was when I was involved to be a commissioner on the WCC Commission for Justice, Peace and Creation. I was placed on an international working group focusing on racism, ethnicity, and Indigenous peoples. Here I learned so much more about manifestations of racism in different parts of the world, including the terrible legacies of racism against the Indigenous peoples. Returning to the United Reformed Church, just to say we are currently having groups working on the legacies of slavery, white privilege, and Black Lives Matter. There is a consultation process taking place that will involve synods engaging with their local churches. And one of the practical pieces of work is to evaluate just now the whole issue of Black leadership in the church, locally, regionally, and URC-wide across the UK, with special emphasis on the upper levels of the structures of the church. I continue to be a racial justice advocate in the URC, and at the same time remain rooted in my local situations, continuing to work with young people on issues of injustice and unequal playing fields. These continue to be my teachers about racism, as well as all the families and young people I've lived my life with in Tottenham for 29 years, and the families of the people I work with in an interfaith context in Ilford. My teachers also include my children and their friends. It has been a humbling experience standing with and by people in the experience and context of suffering from racism. The learning continues, challenging unjust structures and practices in the church, especially those that marginalize Black people, as well as challenging such situations in the community, continue to be important. The learning continues. And I believe that if we are racial justice advocates and activists, this is not something we turn our back on or take a rest from. People are continuing to suffer from racism, as we know. I believe that lessons to be learnt by the church, including never to be complacent about the fact that I heard that some people believe that George Floyd is an isolated incident and it happened in America. I'm reminded of people in Britain who died in police and immigration custody in the past 3 decades. I will name 3 of them: Joy Gardner, Roger Sylvester, Jimmy Magenga, amongst others. And Francis, my husband, while ministering in Tottenham and Ilford, was involved in pastoral care with the families of these 3 people. And whilst institutional racism continues to be alive in all our institutions, such situations can arise anywhere. Another lesson we all need to consider in the church is that the church needs to move from rhetoric to action, which involves putting plans in place in order to build an anti-racist church at all levels of its life and structures. The church is ideally placed in all kinds of ways to provide platforms for discussion, for worship and action. I'd also like to mention that in the last years, I have been involved in writing and producing 7 lots of racial justice materials. And most of those materials I have worked on with ecumenical partners and some within the URC. I pray that with and in God's love, we can all work together in new and tried and tested ways to participate in this essential ministry. I'd like to close with some words from the songwriter Graham Kendrick, from one of his songs. We'll walk for truth, speak out for love. In Jesus' name we shall be strong, to lift the fallen, to save the children, to fill the nation with your song. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Sandra. Next we have David. David, over to you, sir.
Okay, thank you, Richard, and greetings to everybody. Good to meet some old friends again and make some new ones as well. I first got involved in this issue by having the good fortune to attend the World Council of Churches 4th Assembly in Uppsala in 1968. Which was the assembly that gave birth to the program to combat racism the next year. And that was a very influential part of my life in particularly in the links with the anti-apartheid work, which I was involved in the UK. And of course, it addressed racism at all levels, as well as the situation in Southern Africa. And then from 1974 to 1987, I was a Methodist minister in Harlesden in northwest London, with a church that was majority Black members, and had to deal with issues like police raids in my members' houses at 7:30 in the morning, and deportations of families who in some cases been here for several years. And one of my youth members being fitted up by police, dropping cannabis in his car and then charging him for it and so on. So I learned through that experience at grassroots, if you like, what was happening to people in our Black communities. So when the opportunity came to work for what was then CREW, the Community and Race Relations Unit of the British Council of Churches in 1987, I jumped at that opportunity and took with me that experience, that teaching. Just going back to what Sandra was just saying, I learned a lot in that 13 years of ministry in Harlesden, was able to take it into the Community and Race Relations Unit. And then it was decided that the British Council of Churches should change and become First Church, the Council of Churches for Britain and Ireland, but then later CTBI as it is now, with the involvement of the Roman Catholic Church. And the question then became, well, what happens to CREW? And there was an opportunity for commissions to be formed, churches' commissions in the new structures of the CCBI, CTBI. And it wasn't a popular proposal, I have to say, in some of the larger churches. We were seen, I fear, as a bit of a nuisance, but fortunately, Black church leaders stepped up at that point and said, we want a commission for racial justice. I remember particularly Father Olu Abiola, which will be known to some of you, and still lives there in South London in Brixton. He was a pioneer and helped to get us off the ground as the CCRJ, and then served there for several years and covered the kind of areas that we covered were racial violence. We were involved in supporting the Stephen Lawrence campaign, and we produced a whole information pack on racial violence, included even a tape which had even a conservative peer giving her experience of racial attacks in Maidenhead, where she lived, the Baroness from the Indian community. We were able to give the Stephen Lawrence campaign grants from our projects fund, because in those days there was also a projects fund to support initiatives for racial justice. We engaged with the police, and particularly the Met, and had a lot of quite conversations with them, quite robust conversations with quite senior officers about how they ought to behave and how they ought to be able to maintain the relatively few minority officers that they had in those days. We were able to give a grant to the Black Police Association as it began formation, and that battle still continues. I noticed just reading The Guardian today that Millard Scott's partner, and he was someone that we worked with on Broadwater Farm after the uprising there in 1985, and also the photographs taken of the two Black sisters who were murdered in North London. That whole issue of the police and the need to engage with the police continues. There's no question about that. We worked on immigration issues, both trying to get better access to people coming into this country, whether it was refugees or people trying to visit their families, and we worked on stopping the deportations and helped to form the National Coalition of Anti-Deportation Campaigns, again giving modest grants to get them off the ground, and also forming a network of sanctuaries, which was quite strong in the mid-90s, where we had sanctuaries and a range of churches, and also in Hindu temples and mosques as well. We worked in employment issues. And the impact, I think it was quite considerable. I think we, to be honest, really punched above our weight at that particular time. And then Arlington, as Sandra's mentioned, he followed me. I then fear there was a rather diminishing support for the kind of more edgy stuff that the CCRJ was doing, particularly from the larger churches. It was said, well, the commission shouldn't be speaking for the churches on these issues, only the churches should speak for themselves. And that was a kind of change in the ecumenical culture and the ecumenical atmosphere, which I think has been a loss, and pleased to see that Richard has endeavoured to rekindle that kind of edginess. I would still say I think we still need the language, the racial justice language. Richard's got an interesting title, and I guess he's got to cover, as many people have in this field, a range of inequalities and the diversity issues and so on. But I hope we can hold on to that racial justice language. In the context of George Floyd, well, we know that the issue is here as well, in the cases that I've just mentioned a little bit earlier, in relation to our police and in relation to the boat people arriving here and now being diminished as second-class refugees and send them back. The issue is still on the front line, and all of you listening tonight are very much needed to continue our work. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, David. Yeah, really appreciate that. I'm going to move swiftly on to Mesiwa. Mesiwa, over to you in Geneva.
Okay, so thank you. Good evening, friends, brothers and sisters. I greet you all from Geneva, where I am currently. So I am really humbled to be amongst a panel of luminaries, people that have done so much when I'm just a baby starting on this journey. And so while I see that those that have already spoken have looked so far back to look at what they have done, and I am truly inspired, I will look especially at the present and moving on into the future. Not that I have not been involved in justice issues. As I was sharing with Richard a few weeks ago, my work started with really an interest into the hypocrisy that I was experiencing among Christians that proclaim justice and yet at the same time practice injustice in various ways. And so my initial excursion into justice issues was actually related to sexual minorities from the country where I come from. Some of you might know that was not a very easy thing to do, coming from Zimbabwe and talking about sexual minorities and questioning what was supposedly established reason and logic and all the nice things that people could say. And I was coming from a biblical studies training and looking at how the Bible was used and whether the Bible was an instrument for justice or an instrument for injustice. And worryingly and sadly, in many cases, the Bible in the hands of Christians has actually been an instrument of injustice, which is sad. And so my work continued in that line, looking at marginalizations of various capacities on the African continent, but also working with groups outside of the African continent. And so this year, I then joined the World Council of Churches as a program executive for overcoming racism, racial discrimination, and xenophobia, which is a new but old program in a way, because the World Council of Churches has a track record. And I'm not saying that they have been perfect, but they have. From 1948, when the World Council of Churches was formally set up, they identified and agreed with their predecessors that there was a race problem. But what really inspires me is that 20 years later, or slightly above 20 years later, at the Fourth Assembly in Nairobi, Kenya, 1975, the World Council of Churches came to the conviction and confession that racism is a sin, which changes the way in which, as Christians, we look at racism. Because if something is a sin, it's no longer optional for the Christian family to work, to respond, and to eliminate it, because sin is what we stand against. And so since then, the World Council of Churches did quite well. I'm so impressed to listen to people that worked with the program to combat racism, because this year we are marking the 50th anniversary of that program. And so as I speak, like I said, it's a new program because I didn't have somebody handing over this office to me, but it is also very old because it was there from the 1960s, officially taking off the ground in 1971. So this has been the track record amongst or in the work of the World Council of Churches. And so today, the World Council of Churches realizes again the need to refocus, the need to bring back racial justice to the core of its work, which is why I am now part of the World Council of Churches team. And I'm so happy to have been included on this panel and to be with all of you. And I'm looking forward to continue to pester you and to learn from you so that we can work together and you can accompany me on this job. It is my pleasure, honestly, to be part of this platform, and I hope we'll have more opportunities to say more about the work that we are doing. But justice is at the heart of what I do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mesiwa. Thank you very much for that. Going straight over to Rosemary. Rosemary, over to you.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all, and thank you, Richard, again for including me in the panel. I'm going to hopefully focus on a couple of areas of my work. The first area is takes me back to 1991, and I'm cognizant of Mesiwa saying people going far back in their history, so I'll try not to go too far back. But in 1991, when I came to work as an academic in the United Kingdom from Barbados, I started working in the area of Black mental health at the Institute of Psychiatry in London. And at the time, it was a job to help me get some money while I was studying for my doctorate. And I was asked if I would turn my skills onto the work that they were doing around Black mental health. I didn't know that I was walking into a cesspit of issues of injustice and racism, because the work was to look at the rate of psychological illnesses amongst the Black and Asian communities in the UK and throughout different countries in the world. And what I hadn't realized coming in from the Caribbean and previous from Africa was that the levels of diagnosis of Black people was 16 times higher than that of white people in this country. And there were challenges from the community about those diagnostic levels and the treatment that was being meted out to Black people by the Maudsley Hospital and institutions such as that. Well, that was a steep learning curve for me, as I suddenly found myself having to not only learn to understand what was going on within the diagnosis of psychotic illness, but also to bring to the work of the Institute of Psychiatry my own particular understanding of justice and my interpretation of the racialization and the stereotypes applied to people of color within that institution, both in terms of the research, the diagnosis, and then the treatment. So I spent quite a while working at the Institute and being very involved in what I hope was a way of encouraging and engaging researchers and the institution to take a more holistic understanding of identity and culture as it impacted the way in which Black people, Caribbean and African, represented their illnesses, and also the way in which the racialization of and the stereotypes of the psychiatrists was impacting the way in which people were being diagnosed and treated. So I was there for a number of years, and I also worked in the community in Brixton and in Brent with community-based mental health organizations, which were focused on finding more appropriate ways of treatment for, and looking to the well-being of Black people with mental health challenges. I did that, and then I felt the call to ordination, and so started training in 2001. And I was quite surprised that going into another major institution of this country, the church, I found similar levels of stereotyping and racialization of Black people in those institutions as well, and experienced certain amounts of prejudice throughout my training, and then recognized that not only in the training institutions and the people attending, but also in parish life and diocesan structures, there were high levels of racialized attitudes towards people of color, which often meant that people were not brought forward for or accepted for training as stipendiary, that's full-time ministers, and often not as leaders of the Anglican Church as well. Well, there's been about a 20-year period that I've been trained and involved in the Church of England. And from 2007 onwards, I started working at the level of the Diocese of Southwark, which is in South London. Started working in small ways to bring together Black people around issues, UK minority ethnic people, around issues that were of importance to us, focusing around Black History Month, and then building from that event in October, so that that event is no longer an event for people of color, but it's an event for everybody in our diocese, because we now more fully recognize that actually issues of racial justice is not an issue for people of color. It's an issue and a responsibility of everyone. And I think I kind of want to sum up that this work of the last 20 years that I've been involved in, for me, has come to a point where I can now plateau and go off again. And it's because over the past year, and I think specifically out of last year, pandemic and George Floyd, there certainly was an international and a national reckoning on the issue of racism and racial injustice. And a lot of institutions started to look within themselves. Some looked and put out statements and were, in some places, perhaps responding very quickly in a virtue signaling way to let everybody know that they were also attending to these issues. However, the diocese that I'm part of, I spent a lot of time putting together something that I'm very proud of, which is our anti-racism charter, which isn't just a charter that we put on in a book and on the wall, but actually it's a strategy for embedding and enhancing diversity and inclusion in our diocese at every level, whether that's at the church, at the parish, in offices, however we work. We've put together a program and a process for which we are going to put this charter in place, monitor it and evaluate it. And I think, was it Ron that said that racism hasn't gone away? It's been with us for thousands of years, and certainly the last 500 years. And there is no magic bullet to say that this is going to do it all. But every one of us have a responsibility, if it's something that's important to us, to set our marker down and to do what we can, and to find a way that we can contribute to change in the structures around us, to transforming those unjust structures. And so for me, working on this anti-racism charter and now working to embed it within the work in the diocese in South London, and to ensure that I build a platform for others coming through, and a conversation about passing the baton on, about people being over 45 and the need to pass the baton on. I think one of the things I've certainly done is I was a member of what's called the General Synod of the Church of England for 10 years. And this year I deliberately made sure that I didn't stand again, so that I would leave a space for others to take the responsibility to then hopefully be elected, and then take the baton up and to fight that good fight in that principal institution of the Church of England at General Synod. And I'm so thankful that new members have been, and a young woman has been elected onto General Synod. So I feel like I'm doing what I've been called to do, putting my marker down, and then also passing on to the next generation to play their part as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Rosemary. So we've got another 3 speakers. If I could encourage our final 3 speakers to stay within time, so that we've got plenty of opportunity for questions, that'll be fantastic. So the next speaker is Indigene. Over to you, Indigene.
Hi, thank you, Richard. Greetings, everyone. It's a real pleasure to share with all of you, all who are tuned in. and it's an honor to share in this conversation alongside remarkable champions of justice, racial justice. What I want to say is written communication I have in mind, but let me briefly say my passion has been on religious freedom alongside racial justice. From the moment my parents had to leave India after the partition and independence over 70 years ago, owing to the incredible bloodshed that was there, to me being born in Nairobi, living in a thoroughly multicultural, multi-faith environment with friends from every faith you can imagine, from my earliest childhood to arriving in the UK to live here. You know, so immigration and interfaith kind of issues particularly are my lifeblood and an amazing part of my experience. When we came to live in this country, we came to live in Dudley in the West Midlands. My real claim to fame is I went to school with Lenny Henry, and both of us left school without any qualifications whatsoever because our teachers didn't think we were up to any good or any credit. But you know, we've left school and we've made our mark, both of us, to society in this country and wider. In Dudley, our home was very close to Smethwick, and just after we arrived, Enoch Powell made that awful speech in Smethwick, and Martin Luther King was assassinated, and those incidents, those moments, really fired me up and mobilized me. Then, aged 15. To strive for racial justice. What's been said about the importance of young people, you cannot be, understated. All the values which have been so important to me in my senior years were developed in my childhood and in my youth, and so it's really important to harness the potential for leadership in young people, and we ignore that at our peril, because all of us who are on this panel and all of us who are tuned in, we've all been there right from our earliest days, from our childhood, and we should recognize that young people today have the same passions too. So my first ministry was in Wolverhampton, but before I came to Wolverhampton, while I was a young teenager, a Methodist minister asked me in Dudley if a vacant Methodist church could be sold to the Sikh community, and I said, of course we can. And I was 15 at the time, and he was checking with me because there was nobody else he could talk to, and that Methodist church became a Sikh temple, and it's where my family worship up to this day. And then in Wolverhampton, when I was about 20, I remember a Methodist minister in a predominantly Sikh community saying, what's the role of the church here in this environment, Indigene? And I was saying, just talk with your neighbors of other faiths and build relationships. And that was the beginnings of the very first interfaith group in Britain. And now there are around 400 interfaith groups, and all of them recognizing the need for us all to build relationships and to work with each other, and not only ecumenically, but ecumenically in the broader sense, with all the faiths, to do all we can to bring justice and to make life better for everyone. And remember those days of the 80s of what was called the riots, young people in the streets agitating for justice. I remember 3 days and 3 nights being in the streets of Handsworth and being there and running at the police alongside young people. I mean, I didn't carry anything in my hands, but I was with the young people who were about my age, in their middle 20s, and just feeling the intense anger in young people at the way police were harassing them and treating them, and the violence and the racism of police. That's nothing new, that issue which is being talked about now. It's been there. Back in the early 80s, a young man called Clinton Mckirbin was killed while he was being arrested by a policeman in Wolverhampton. You know, the George Floyd of our times, all those years ago, and organizing a massive march against police violence and racism in Wolverhampton. And it didn't catch much attention, but we were there, and the issues which are before us are not new, and as it's been said, they're not going to go away. Racism is like COVID, it's there and it impacts everyone, and we're going to have to deal with it all through our lives, and people who follow us will be having to do exactly the same. Black leadership has been very important to me, developing and promoting Black leadership. I've tried to do that within the life of the Methodist Church. Black theology, I think we really have to address theological issues. I organized the very first International Black Theology Conference in Britain in 1993 and held it in the church where I was minister. And in 2 years' time, 30 years on, I'm working with colleagues to organize the first International Asian Theology, because I think that's an angle that's neglected and undervalued and needs to be, we have to raise the profile. And justice in immigration is critical. And when I walked from Sheffield to London asking for a justice for asylum seekers who are referred to as people seeking sanctuary, I was called a loony, a lefty, mad person. Why are you doing that? Well, when mad things happen, sometimes what we do appears a little bit mad to others. But out of all that, and through working with the community and race relations units within the ecumenical instruments, I've developed the whole sanctuary work, which has grown into then now an initiative. Just as the interfaith work grew from a small conversation on how to relate to people of other faiths, the City of Sanctuary movement has grown out of how are we to respond to perhaps the most vulnerable people in our society, people seeking sanctuary, beginning with children, being highlighted by Amal, the puppet refugee walking 5,000 miles from Syria, and who will arrive in Sheffield in a couple of days, raising the profile of child refugees who are pushed pillar to post. 10,000 unaccompanied refugee children in Britain who are not being welcomed in the way a puppet will be welcomed all along the route. So my dear friends, enormous issues, and I think they operate at structural, individual, and theological levels, and we have to address them at all levels. And we can't ever think the work is done. In many ways, we're only at the beginning of the journey. We have a long way to go. I've often said I've been more involved in the work of racial justice longer than the children of Israel were in the wilderness. Well, 40 years in the wilderness did not bring them to where God wanted them to be. And we haven't finished our work. There is much more to do. And I feel strengthened by all of you. And I see hope in the young people of today. When I look at them and what they're doing and their passions, I feel, yeah, we have leadership for the future. Let's build that. Thank you and bless you.
Thank you very much for that, Indigene. Over now to Wale, and then we're going to have Glenn. And again, just encourage you to kind of just keep within that time. Be fantastic. So Wale, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Richard, for inviting me into this particular space. I've been a racial justice coordinator for the Baptist Union for around 18, maybe 19 years. That's quite a long time. And during that period, I've learned a number of lessons. And so some of the lessons that I've learned, I want to kind of briefly share with you. So one of the lessons, for example, that I've learned with regards racial justice and its need to be able to transform the culture as well as individuals relates to a development of a theology around creative anger. I remember it was about 4 or 5 years ago when I was speaking at a conference and I was speaking about Sam Sharp. And clearly Sam Sharp was a man who challenged the status quo and sought to bring about, substantive change as a result of justified protestation. So naturally I was speaking passionately, and I was speaking with a level of creative anger or angst or pathos, define it as you deem appropriate. And after I'd finished speaking, a gentleman came up to me and said that he felt that I was speaking like an angry Black man. Well, it was an offensive statement, but actually it was a helpful statement, because what it did is that it enabled me to start to reflect upon the theology of creative anger, the importance of it, the need to own it. That's that thing within your internal humanity that compels you to make a difference, recognizing that there is injustice out there and inside. Our response to that needs to be challenging, it needs to be combative, and that combative dynamic is underpinned by a level of creative anger. I've also learned and continue to learn that if racial justice is to be transformative, then whiteness needs to be not just critiqued, that's important, not just challenged again, that's vitally important, but it actually needs to be dismantled. And that's because it's endemic, it's systemic within the very systems that we seek to negotiate and navigate. And that's because whiteness is inherently has strong associations with racism. And so the only way in which we are to really transform the cultures that we live within is by seeking to dismantle whiteness. Now, that is obviously extremely difficult, but nevertheless, it is a journey that I think we need to constantly embark upon. And another lesson that I've learned is gradualism curtails progress and development, and it also curtails, often prohibits justice from being actualized and implemented. So I understand now why Martin Luther King in particular had no track at all for gradualism and sought to repudiate and challenge it, because what gradualism does is that it essentially contains and limits, indeed even constrains our voices on the basis that we need to be careful what we say, and we need to embark upon this racial justice journey in a gradual, incremental way, which sometimes does not bring about change, but often it doesn't bring about change because gradualism has the capacity to contain the human voice. And another lesson that I've learned is Black and brown people need to sustain our prophetic voice. So that is extremely, extremely difficult because we get tired and we want to stop talking, and that the structures that we kind of inhabit sometimes are so pressing down upon us that we lose that anger, creative anger, and we lose that prophetic voice. But if racial justice is to be authentically transformational, We need to sustain somehow that prophetic voice in those really problematic and awkward spaces. And the final thing that I continue to learn is how important it is to have friends in this space and racial justice allies. So in that context, I'd like to say thank you to a number of people that have enabled me to continue along this very challenging and difficult journey. So people like Alicia Lewis, people like Rosemary Davison-Gotobed, people like and Anthony Reddy and Robert Beckford, and a good friend of mine, who most of you possibly wouldn't have heard of. His name is Richard Reddy. So I beg your pardon, it's not Richard Reddy, it's Richard Kidd, sorry Reddy. Though you are a good friend. His name is Richard Kidd, and he has been a great friend and mentor, but those allies and those friends have been critical to me to ensure, hopefully, that I've been able to maintain and sustain that prophetic edge.
Thank you very much for that, Wale. And then finally, we've got Glyn. So Glyn, over to you. Stay within the limit, and then we're going to have our questions. So Glyn, last but clearly not least, over to you, madam.
Are you hearing me now?
Yep, we're hearing you.
Right. Richard, I'd like to thank you for going back in time and reaching out to many of us who pioneered racial justice work in the churches. And, you know, I'm so happy to see so many people who I worked with ecumenically in those early years. That was a time of refreshing and strengthening, because sometimes I felt so battered by the Church of England and the systems with which we were dealing. In 1987, the committee was set up, the Committee on Black Anglican Concerns, and to work at the national level to combat institutional racism. And the Church of England is like a huge liner. So you're dealing with levels of structures and structures and structures. And it wasn't easy work at all. It was pioneering work. Bishop Wilfred Wood was the chairman and I was the secretary. And there was a secretary appointed to assist me. And he offered a lot of very helpful advice. In fact, Bishop was like a mentor to me because I had just arrived in the UK in 1986. And in 1987, I was appointed. I taught for a while and then I was interviewed for the job, 2 interviews and then appointed. And so Bishop's advice was invaluable because he had lived with racism. He knew about the struggle in British society, very often from his own experience. And I also complemented that by meeting with the chairs and secretaries of General Synod boards and councils, because the work was about getting them to combat institutional racism. And also visiting the diocese, several of the dioceses, in order to familiarize myself on the issues. The committee operated within a threefold theological framework: the nature of God, one God, a Trinity in unity, a God of justice and mercy. Secondly, the nature of humanity. Men and women of every hue and ethnic group belong to the one human race, are all made in the image of God, and each is of unique worth in his sight. And thirdly, the nature of the church, a people called into being through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ to be a community of reconciliation, love, justice, and sharing a foretaste of God's eternal kingdom. Could we get the church to understand the nature of racism, and that the church through its institutions might be unwittingly acting in a racist manner? It was a hard task. CBA's principal task was to monitor issues arising or which ought to arise in the context of the work of the Standing Committee to whom we reported, which was a subcommittee of the Archbishop's Council, the Central Board of Finance, the Synod's boards and councils, and of the General Synod itself. We could ask questions of them as far as what they were doing had policy implications for minority ethnic groups within the church and the wider community. And the committee's membership included representatives from General Synod board and councils. In 1990 and 1996, the terms of reference were revised as it was clear that we needed to work with the diocese and the parishes as well at the national level. So it was, in a way, a top-down, bottom-up kind of approach. After my retirement, I wrote An Amazing Journey, the Church of England's Response to Institutional Racism, published in 2003, which provides a full account of the work which was done over 14 years. I worked for 3 committees and 3 chairs over the years and found committee members and staff very supportive. Within me, I felt that it was God's work and prayed daily for wisdom and discernment in tackling it. And so I'll share with you just very briefly some of the successes we had. I'll just highlight some themes. Relationships with the General Synod boards and councils. In fact, they assisted us very much with budgeting when we needed to do particular projects. We would prepare project proposals and get funding and technical support because, believe it or not, we had no budget. The committee had no budget. Secondly, equal opportunities policy that was set up and training was made available for the national church institutions. And heads of departments had to be trained in equal opportunity policy. It wasn't optional, and it was part of their assessment. 3, encouragement and empowerment of minority ethnic Anglicans. Because people came into the church battered by the society, and the church battered people because of the racism that people were experiencing. And so the network that was set up, the Link Persons Network, Diocesan Link Persons, which seemed to be older people. And then we had a young Black Anglican network as well. And these were supported by the diocesan bishops. Then we did diocesan team visits, where we would spend 2 to 3 days within a diocese for the purpose of listening and learning, raising issues, meeting with other people involved in race relations matters, in secular organizations, other religious groups. And usually it was a team of 4 or 5 of us. So we could split up to cover meetings because meetings were held over a 2 to 3 day period. And we visited 38 of the 44 dioceses, and 2 in fact were repeats. The General Synod election pack was written and was so considered so good that dioceses requested packs from us. So that was a good piece of work as well. And it was updated as necessary with each synod, because those of you might know that synod elections are held every 5 years. Young Black Anglicans research, I felt that it was important to know what young people were thinking. That's part of my background as a teacher, of course. And we got funding from the Church Urban Fund, a researcher, and she wrote the publication Simply Value Us as a result of having conducted interviews with young people. And one of the things that remained with me, the young people were saying, they want us in the church, but when we're there, they don't know what to do with us. So, and Anne-Marie Parker, she was a recent graduate at the time, young graduate, and I owe her a tremendous amount of gratitude because she came and picked up and ran with some of the youth work over a period of 2 years. So Anne-Marie, if you're here or someone who knows you, please pass on my thanks to Anne-Marie. Then this, my attitude was very much about encouraging young people to come forward. And so when I was invited to international conferences, I invited young people to go along as well. We raised money. Some of them raised money from the parishes. I raised money from the center. And so we had young people going with us on conferences to South Africa, to Austria, and the United States through the Episcopal Church. Harold Lewis was my counterpart in the Episcopal Church of America, in charge of Black issues. And so he invited some of our young people to visit and attend the Episcopal Church, the Black Episcopalians, their conference that they held there. And then a group from America came over to us at a later point in time. Always I felt it was important to include young people. And when the conference in South Africa, there was it was international. And there was one particular delegation which had someone of 90 years old, but had no young people in it, in the delegation. So I found that interesting. And in fact, we were the only delegation of the entire conference with young people. The 1994 Black Anglican celebration for the decade of evangelism. I will not go into that. It was a fantastic event. It was a watershed event in the Anglican Church, the Church of England. And archbishops attended, Archbishop Carey and Habgood, 30 bishops, 5 participants from each diocese attended, mainly Black Anglicans. We insisted on that. And we had representatives from the Diocese of Europe, from Belgium, from Germany, and from Sweden. And of course, General Synod boards and councils were there, ecumenical observers, and some of you would have been there. Okay.
Glenn, can I've got some questions that I want to ask, and one of them is to you. So listen, could I just encourage you to wrap it up right there?
Yes.
Because we've got a number of questions here, and I really just want to give folk an opportunity to ask questions. So Glenn,
yes.
Just ask you, I think you've told us some fantastic things there. And also, I think if people want to know more, Mike, if you could highlight me, Mike, if people want to know more, then it's all in your fantastic book here, and amazing.
Yes, yes.
So that's what I'm encouraging people to look out for. That book. It's still available on Amazon, no doubt, and even eBay. So listen, let's crack on. Let's look at these questions now. And given the time, we need to be short. We need to be curt. We need to be succinct in our responses. So got a question here from Dorrit Atkins, who says, why are Black people still experiencing discrimination in the UK and other parts of the world after being settled for more than 60 years in the United Kingdom? Atkins, she sent that in earlier when she registered. I'm going to put that to Rosemary. Rosemary, I need a sharp answer from you. I need an Anglican answer. That's an answer that takes an Anglican answer, Rosemary. Right now.
The answer is not Anglican. The answer is just the fact that structural racism continues to keep power in the hands of those who are white, male, and rich. And it means that class and gender and ethnicity continues to push people and oppress people. Black people are still viewed through the lens of slavery or imperialism, and their disempowerment continues through language, through culture, and an understanding that we're not as civilized still as others who seem to have felt that they had a task to civilize us. So racism continues. Indigene has said it, others have said it. We need to continue to fight against the structures which work to oppress people, and they will use whatever means to oppress. And ethnicity is a wonderful trope to use to push down a whole people, and it happens worldwide.
Okay, thank you very much for that. But another question here. So it's how were you viewed by the church and Christians in general when you did this racial justice work? That's from Paul Machuki. And again, that was sent in earlier. And I'm going to put this one to Sandra, and I'm going to put it also to Kumar. And again, if you could keep your responses as curt as possible, that'd be fantastic. So first you, Sandra, then Kumar.
Sorry, technical thing. I've worked with so many different groups and different individuals, it's very difficult to give a general answer. I mean, when I've worked with groups that are in multicultural situations and inner city situations, when we're working with groups, people seem to, well, in my experience, people seem to be on board. But going out to the more sort of suburbs, white churches, I found that there's a lot of interest, but it's like intellectual, whereas the inner city places, there's a heart there, there's a heart and there's feelings and there's experiences. The only real resistance I found was challenging a committee in the URC that was relating to youth work, and Black young people were going to this event and finding when I went for the first time, finding that it was the loneliest time they'd ever spent. Racial justice advocates, we worked with this, and then because it didn't work, challenging this committee, we then went back to a new group of young people who were running the event, and they were open to talk. They were open and were admitting things that were wrong, like missing people out of photographs and things like that. So I think that that was a real resistance, but keeping on to it as racial justice advocates and working with a new group of young people, change did actually come. So I'm just saying there's a variety of experiences I've had.
Excellent, thank you. Same question to you, Kumar.
I very much echo Sandra's answers. There is a variety. I would say within the church as an institution, quite often they want to be seen to be doing the right thing, but then structures are very, very slow to change. And often you find that it may be one step forward, two steps back. And therefore the progress is very, very slow. And you need to keep at it. With regard to churches within the Baptist structure, if the minister doesn't open the door to you, you can't get in. And so that was often, so if the minister wasn't interested, did not want to engage, that's it, that you had no access into the church to do anything. So I think the ministers were key, and I think I sought to engage with them to basically conscientize them as to why they should engage with this, and then hopefully the congregants would open.
Thank you very much. I've got another question here, and this is actually specifically for Ron Nathan. It says, Ron, when you led ASEA, how did the churches respond to your message? And that's anonymous. So Ron, where's Ron? Ron, you in Barbados? Are you?
Wow, anonymous, huh? Okay.
Yeah. I wonder why.
I think there are two answers. One, many of the Black churches themselves were uncomfortable with addressing or raising the issue of racial justice because sometimes they didn't want to rock the boat or be seen to be creating any difficulty with their colleagues, or even raising those questions because it may agitate the youth within their congregations. On the other hand, when we spoke up at ASEA, many white evangelicals also became uncomfortable because at least during the years that I was there, I slightly shifted the emphasis in ASEA to create capacity to serve the Black church and the Black community rather than the emphasis being we want to be seen to be in gatherings where there was a multicultural, multiracial group. And because what I was trying to suggest was that we need to bring something to the table rather than it being perceived that we were always begging to come to the table and be served by others.
Excellent, thank you very much. Got a question here from Mesiwa, and sort of two questions. I think you answered the first bit, Mesiwa, about what the WCC is doing, but the second bit of the question is about the UN Decade of African People. Are you able to give us an update on that, what's happening there?
Well, I'm not an expert on that, Richard, but from the time that I've joined the World Council of Churches, here's what I know. Now, you know, as always, the United Nations will take years, decades even, to pass any resolutions that target Black people, people of African descent. So for years, I think there was this discussion, and then the decade came into being in 2013. But in reality, this is a decade that has really not made any significant progress until a few months or 2 months ago, when the UN Permanent Forum for People of African Descent was finally agreed upon, which is basically the real first step into this decade at the United Nations level, but this is coming 6 years into this decade. And so you can imagine that there is still a lot that has to be done, and I understand there are colleagues that are working around it. We are actually currently having the African Diaspora Conference ongoing, and that's part of that discussion on how we can possibly maximize what remains of this decade. So it's something that's there, but as usual, not very effective.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. We've got another question here, and it's about, it says, that it's from Sonia Walker. She says, in my opinion, the churches are more interested in climate justice than racial justice. What do you think? And I'm going to put that one to David Haslam.
Yeah, I think this is a really important question, because I would like to see climate justice a lot more integrated with racial justice, or vice versa, however you want to put it. It came home to me in hearing on, I think it was the World Council of Churches webinar on this whole area, pointing out that in fact the climate crisis affects Black people, people of minorities all over the world, indigenous peoples, far more than it affects white people. And that's partly why there's so little movement on it, that even in the white church leadership, although I'd say World Council of Churches is taking some leadership on this. I noticed they've got a webinar tomorrow at 5 o'clock about fossil fuel divestment and COP26 and so on. But every time white people mention climate justice, just make the point that, and it affects people of color much more around the world than it does white people. And that perhaps we need to be very well aware of.
And fantastic and nice and succinct as well. Okay, the next question is, and I think you've said some of this already, but it's, I'm going to put it to Indigene. It's who or what inspired you to engage in this work? That's from Edgar G. Smallwood. So that's to Indigene. So Indigene, what inspired you? I know he's with us. Indigene?
Yeah, hi. I was inspired by all the people who are here on the screen. You know, they're all amazing people. All the people who are listed in the book, they've all been a great inspiration to me. But in particular, people like, as I mentioned, Martin Luther King. I mean, he's had a big influence on me, and his sermons. I read his sermons, and I'm inspired by them. And other Black preachers, you know, I read sermons and speeches by Black people, women and men. Just read those, listen to them on YouTube and what have you, and you will find great inspiration there. Yeah, so in addition to all those on the screen, Richard, it's a vast number of people, a lot of Indian theologians, though. Rabindranath Tagore, his writings matter a lot to me, and like Martin Luther King's sermons in Strength in Strength to Love, and Rabindranath Tagore's writing, like his book Gitanjali, they're my other New Testaments.
Excellent, thank you for that. So I've got a question here. I'm going to put it says that since the murder of George Floyd, there's been renewed focus on racial justice in the church. When did racial justice stop being on the church's agenda, and was it ever on the agenda? So that's a question mark, and that's anonymous. And I'm going to put that one to Wale, and I'm also going to put it to Glyn. So if you could give us a nice sharp response, that would be fantastic. So Wale first, and then Glyn.
I'm not convinced, Richard, that it has really been on the agenda of the church, if I'm honest with you. I think issues around multiculturalism and inclusivity and diversity have been, but I think there are huge theological differences between those things and racial justice. I think the thing about racial justice is that it calls for and demands radical change from within, which impacts the external. That is a huge internal paradigm shift which white people need to participate in. And so I think many of them have been reluctant to actually engage racial justice because of the sacrifice it demands for racial justice to become a reality in the space that they navigate.
Excellent. And Glenn, if over to you.
Yes, racial justice has been on the agenda for some time. I remember Ken Leach, Reverend Ken Leach, who died some time ago. You would know of him and his work. And he did a lot of work in the parishes for the Church of England up to 1986. And then our work took over in 1987. It's never really been off the agenda, but sometimes I get the impression that it's somehow on the back burner. I feel within myself that even though people were there doing work on behalf of the church, I don't know to what extent it was really, any of it has always been taken seriously. And that's a problem I think the Church of England has, where the top priority isn't given to the work. So the resources aren't put in to do the work. And that is a big lack, because the church has the money and the resources to do what it wants to do. But is it a priority? And that's a problem. But one thing I'd want to say is that since the George Floyd murder, you will notice that the archbishops came out with a joint statement. At the time, Archbishop Welby and Archbishop John Sentimo came out with a joint statement. And you know of the publication From Lament to Action. This is a report that has been was commissioned by the archbishops, and they have identified, the group have identified very clearly issues that the church must address, and not to go back and be doing yet another report, because 160 recommendations have come through on different reports over the years since the 1980s. So the Church of England has a lot to do, and it's important to get on with it and really do something positive. And because it's the established church and it needs to set an example, and right now we're not there at all. So please let us hope that From Lament to Action will be a shining light, and that we'll have some hope that something can happen in the Church of England.
Okay, thank you very much. And on that topic of being a shining light, I'd like to bring this webinar to a close. First, I'd like to thank our esteemed speakers for their sterling contributions. I'd also like to thank my colleague, Mike, my CTBI colleague, Mike, who's been doing all the technical things on Zoom for this webinar this evening. Thank you very much, Mike, for that. I'd also offer apologies to those who sent in questions and we didn't get to ask you questions. But what we'll do is we will collect them and put them on the CTBI website and do our best to respond to them. So apologies once again. As I said before, this webinar will be available on the CTBI website from tomorrow. But before I sign off, I'd just like to make you aware of an excellent event at Bloomsbury Baptist Church in central London this Friday. It's from 2 p.m. It's at 2 p.m. and also 7 p.m. And we're looking at the 60th anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King's first preaching engagement in Britain. And that was actually at Bloomsbury Baptist Church on the 29th of October in 1961. And I'm going to be one of the speakers. And if you want to attend, you can either attend in person or you can attend online. And you can get that information from the Bloomsbury Baptist Church. So finally, just want to say thank you for taking the time out of your schedule, all you good folk in Zoom land. Thank you for joining us, much appreciated. Please stay with us on this particular journey. And if you want to find out any more information about the work that CTBI is doing, please look on our website. But with that in mind, good night. Thank you.
Good night.
Right.